What advice would you give to people in their later life to enable them to do this, when most of them must in fact believe that death is the end of everything?
Well, you see, I have treated many old people, and it's quite interesting to watch what the unconscious is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. And so I think it is better for old people to live on, to look forward to the next day, as if he had to spend centuries. And then he lives properly. But when he is afraid, when he doesn't look forward, he looks back, he petrifies, he gets stiff and he dies before his time. But when he is living on, looking forward to the great adventure that is ahead, then he lives. And that is about what the unconscious is intending to do. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything. But nevertheless, there is something in us that doesn't believe it, apparently. But this is merely a fact, a psychological fact. Doesn't mean to me that it proves something. It is simply so. For instance, I may not know why we need salt, but we prefer to eat salt too, because you feel better. And so when you think in a certain way, you may feel considerably better. And I think if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly.
Carl Jung's essay, The Stages of Life, beautifully captures the human psychological development that extends from childhood to the peculiarities and problems of adult life. Written as a comprehensive examination of psychic life from the cradle to the grave, Jung's work focuses on the problems, contradictions, and transformative crises that define our passage through the stages of life. This essay also explores Jung's central thesis that consciousness emerges through the tension between instinct and culture. It is a story about life's major transitions, their implications, aging, meaning, and psychological health. Jung wrote this essay in 1930, when the world was about to plunge into its darkest decade. Perhaps it's no coincidence that he chose to explore the architecture of a life well lived, just as civilization was forgetting how to live at all. There's something both prophetic and redemptive in timing like that, and I honestly feel we need this now more than ever. If Freud gave us the basement of the psyche, Jung offered us the whole house, including the attic where we store our dreams and the garden where meaning grows. This is Irevelato, a channel dedicated to revealing the hidden connections between domains, the secrets you deserve to know, the lives and stories of luminaries and gods. Today we think broadly and psychologically. In this 2-hour exploration, we'll trace Jung's ideas in his brilliant essay. Each section is meant to help you digest the main ideas more easily. Additional commentaries and observations elaborate on Jung's ideas as well. Before we begin this journey, I want to thank you for being here. Your engagement, whether through likes, shares, or simply watching these video essays through to completion, helps ensure they reach others who seek deeper understanding, who love wisdom, who would sacrifice themselves for truth and freedom, who bears the price of Lucifer and Prometheus if that's what we need to move forward and realize that we are descendants of luminaries and stand on the shoulders of giants, as Newton used to say. There's a reason why you are here. See it, seize it, conquer it. If you believe in the value of my work, if it has moved you, transformed you, or renewed something within you, consider supporting me on Patreon. This project demands my full attention, and it often takes immense effort to keep everything running smoothly without financial backing. Most Patreon tiers come with additional benefits as a gesture of gratitude. If you'd like monthly face-to-face calls with the man behind the AI voice, the Philosopher Kings tier is for you, 33 slots in total, with only 30 available at the time of writing. If there's a topic you'd like me to explore in depth, the Magus tier allows you to commission essays, limited to 12 spots. And if you feel our paths align, if you want to look under the hood of Irevelato and its inner workings, and want to learn exactly what I do, the Eternal Sun tier awaits. Only 3 seats are open. To my current patrons, you are the fire that keeps my mind sharp and focused on what truly matters. I am deeply grateful. Still, whether or not you support financially, thank you for being here. Money is only a tool, but with a sharp, awakened mind, you can help shape a better future. For both of us. And that, in the end, is more than enough. Now let's begin. Early in the essay, Jung makes a fundamental observation. There are no problems without consciousness. This deceptively simple statement reveals the core of his psychological philosophy. Unlike primitive humans who live within the security of instinct, civilized individuals must navigate a world where consciousness has created distance from natural guidance. Jung argues that consciousness itself emerges from humanity's turning away from instinct and opposing natural impulses with rational thought. However, unfortunately, the separation from instinct, while enabling culture and civilization, comes at a psychological cost. Think of a bird that has learned to navigate by GPS instead of magnetic fields. The technology is impressive, but something essential has been traded away. This is our modern predicament, brilliant, conscious, and somehow lost. Jung describes consciousness as humanity's Promethean conquest, a reference that captures both the triumph and the burden of human awareness. He warns of an all-too-human fear that consciousness, our Promethean conquest, may in the end not be able to serve us as well as nature. Like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, consciousness grants humans tremendous power, but also subjects them to new forms of suffering. Because Prometheus didn't just steal fire from the gods, he stole the burden of choice itself. Every flame that warms us also burns. Every light that guides us also blinds us to the comfortable darkness we once knew. The Greeks understood this burden perfectly. In their mythology, every gift from the gods came with a price. Pandora's curiosity, Prometheus's fire, Cassandra's prophecy. Consciousness is humanity's mixed blessing. The light that reveals also exposes. The knowledge that empowers also obligates. The biblical metaphor of the fall from paradise serves as Jung's central symbol for this transformation. Jung writes that the biblical fall of man presents the dawn of consciousness as a curse. This reframes the Genesis story as a psychological necessity rather than a moral failing, the inevitable price of human awareness. Paradise was never a place. It was a state of unconscious unity, like a child's perfect trust in a mother's arms. We didn't lose paradise, we outgrew it. And like all growing, it hurt. To say we outgrew paradise is to say that innocence is not the telos of humanity, but the womb, necessary, warm, but not the final form. The Genesis myth, like the myths of Prometheus, of Inanna's descent, of the Gnostic Sophia, or the Vedic Varuna, reveals an archetype older than language. The expulsion from unknowing is the price of becoming. When Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge, they are initiated rather than punished. The serpent, far from being a villain, plays the ancient role of the daimonic mediator, the agathodaimon, the wise dragon, the Ophite symbol of transformation. Thus, Eden is the garden we must leave so that we might till the field of meaning. Every culture worth its salt teaches this, that to be human is to bear the wound of awareness, to trade the seamless fabric of instinct for the agony and ecstasy of choice. We outgrew paradise, yes, but it is only in the wilderness that gods are born. Jung's description of how problems emerge is particularly striking. Everything in us that still belongs to nature shrinks away from a problem, for its name is doubt, and wherever doubt holds sway, there is uncertainty and the possibility of divergent ways. Doubt is the democracy of the mind. In the kingdom of instinct, there is only one voice, one direction, one way forward. But consciousness makes us a congress of competing voices, and suddenly we must learn the art of self-governance. Problems draw individuals into an orphaned and isolated state where we are abandoned by nature and are driven to consciousness. Yet he sees this as ultimately beneficial. Every problem, therefore, brings the possibility of a widening of consciousness, but also the necessity of saying goodbye to childlike unconsciousness and trust in nature. Most powerfully, Jung observes our resistance to growth. Everyone gladly turns away from his problems. If possible, they must not be mentioned, or better still, their existence is denied. We wish to make our lives simple, certain and smooth, and for that reason, problems are taboo. Yet he insists that certainties can arise only through doubt and results only through experiment. The artful denial of a problem will not produce conviction. On the contrary, a wider and higher consciousness is required to give us the certainty and clarity we need. Here, Jung anticipates what cognitive therapists would later discover, that our relationship to our thoughts matters more than the thoughts themselves. This is why the scientific method and Jung's approach to the psyche share a common wisdom. Both recognize that our most cherished certainties must be held lightly, ready to evolve when new evidence emerges. The laboratory of consciousness, like any good lab, must be willing to revise its hypotheses. Jung outlines 3 stages in the development of consciousness, each representing a more complex form of psychological organization. The first stage he characterizes as anarchic or chaotic, consisting of basic recognition or knowing. This initial consciousness involves simple connections between psychic contents, namely when a child recognizes a person or an object, like the first tentative handshake between strangers who will become lifelong friends. Jung notes that continuous memory typically begins only when the ego complex develops sufficient energy, marking the transition to self-awareness. This marks the birth of self-consciousness, which is the capacity to observe oneself from a distance, to become both actor and audience in the theatre of one's own mind. It's like the moment a child first sees themselves in a mirror and realizes that reflection is me, and suddenly there's both a self that looks and a self that is seen. The ego complex creates what Jung called the observer self, which is the part of us that can step back and witness our own psychological processes. The second stage represents the development of a unified ego complex, which Jung terms monarchic or monistic. During this phase, the individual develops a consistent sense of self and begins to speak in the first person. This stage, extending through much of childhood, is characterized by dependence on parents and the absence of genuine psychological problems. Children don't have existential crises because they haven't yet discovered that existence is questionable. They live in the eternal present tense, like cats, like mystics, like gods before the fall. The third stage brings an awareness of the divided or dualistic state. This crucial development occurs when a second psychic complex of equal intensity emerges alongside the ego complex, creating internal conflict. Jung describes this as the birth of true psychological problems. This produces the division with oneself, the state that betokens a problem. This internal division, however, while challenging, represents a necessary evolution toward greater psychological sophistication. We might say that true thinking begins when we discover we can argue with ourselves and both sides can be right. This is either the birth of wisdom or the onset of madness, sometimes both. Jung's analysis of youth, extending from puberty to approximately age 40, focuses on the fundamental task of engaging with external reality. He identifies the core challenge of this period as overcoming a more or less patent clinging to the childhood level of consciousness and accepting what is different and strange as a part of his own life. In a particularly insightful passage, Jung describes the essential resistance of youth. Something in us wishes to remain a child, to be unconscious or at most conscious only of the ego, to reject everything strange or else subject it to our will, to do nothing or else indulge our own craving for pleasure or power. In all this there is something of the inertia of matter. It is a persistence in the previous state whose range of consciousness is smaller, narrower, and more egoistic than that of the dualistic phase. Newton's first law applies to psychology too. A young person at rest tends to stay at rest. A young person in motion tends to stay in motion in the same direction, unless acted upon by an outside force. Usually that force is called reality, and it's notoriously unsympathetic to our personal momentum. The problems of youth typically arise from false assumptions about life, exaggerated expectations, underestimation of difficulties, unjustified optimism, or a negative attitude. Jung recognizes that these difficulties may be external, such as conflicts between subjective assumptions and reality, or internal, such as psychic imbalances related to sexuality or feelings of inferiority. Youth approaches life like a tourist with a guidebook written by someone who has never been there. The maps are beautiful, the descriptions vivid, but somehow the actual territory keeps surprising us. Importantly, Jung distinguishes between having problems and being neurotic in a passage that deserves special attention. There is a marked difference between the two in that the neurotic is ill because he is unconscious of his problems, while the person with a difficult temperament suffers from his conscious problems without being ill. Jung thus makes a crucial distinction. Neurosis is unconscious suffering. Character is conscious suffering. One is a prison, the other is a gymnasium. We choose our weights, not our weakness. This insight reframes psychological suffering as potentially healthy when it occurs with awareness. The difference between unconscious suffering and conscious suffering is the difference between Oedipus blindly fulfilling fate and Oedipus standing in full awareness, putting out his eyes. It is the difference between the wound and the wound transformed into wisdom. In myth, the hero always suffers, but the hero suffers with meaning. Gilgamesh, in his grief, does not numb himself. He sets out into the unknown. Buddha sees the suffering of the world and renounces the palace. Christ does not escape the cross, but climbs it voluntarily, like Sisyphus, and is crowned not despite his agony, but because of it. Neurosis is the passive inheritance of the unprocessed shadow. Character is the conscious transmutation of that shadow into substance. Jung knew that wholeness was never comfortable. It is fire, forge, and the philosopher's stone. Jung argues that the essential task of youth involves expanding one's horizon of life, or what he calls borrowing from Goethe, a diastole or expansion. Goethe's diastole comes from cardiology, the heart's expansion phase. Jung is suggesting that youth is psychological systole, the heart of the psyche, learning to fill itself with experience before it can effectively pump that experience out into the world. The danger lies in avoiding this expansion. Whoever protects himself against what is new and strange and regresses to the past falls into the same neurotic condition as the man who identifies himself with the new and runs away from the past. Both approaches represent failures to achieve what Jung calls a state of wider and higher consciousness. Balance is a dynamic dance. Like a tightrope walker, we stay upright not by standing still but by constant, subtle adjustments. The walker who refuses to move falls as surely as the one who moves too recklessly. Balance, in the alchemical tradition, is never a static midpoint. It is always the living intercourse between opposites. Hermes stands at the crossroads to show that the soul must walk between. The Tao is not peace through stillness, but stillness amid motion, like water flowing over stone, flexible and invincible. The alchemists called it the coincidentia oppositorum, the sacred marriage of sun and moon, sulfur and mercury, king and queen. To stand on the rope is to suffer the tension of the opposites, and to refuse either fall into chaos or rigidity. Jung called this the transcendent function, or the emergent third that arises when one can hold contradiction without collapse. In that trembling, dangerous walk, something miraculous happens. The self is born. Perhaps Jung's most influential contribution concerns the psychological transformation that occurs around midlife. Using the metaphor of the sun's daily journey, he describes how life's noon brings a fundamental reversal of values and orientations. His solar metaphor is particularly vivid and worth quoting at length. In order to characterize it, I must take for comparison the daily course of the sun, but a sun that is endowed with human feeling and man's limited consciousness. In the morning, it rises from the nocturnal sea of unconsciousness and looks upon the wide, bright world which lies before it in an expanse that steadily widens the higher it climbs in the firmament. In this extension of its field of action, caused by its own rising, the sun will discover its significance. It will see the attainment of the greatest possible height and the widest possible dissemination of its blessings as its goal. In this conviction, the sun pursues its course to the unforeseen zenith. Unforeseen because its career is unique and individual, and the culminating point could not be calculated in advance. At the stroke of noon, the descent begins, and the descent means the reversal of all the ideals and values that were cherished in the morning. The sun falls into contradiction with itself. It is as though it should draw in its rays instead of emitting them. Light and warmth decline and are at last extinguished. Every sunset promises sunrise. Jung's metaphor contains its own hope, even as it describes life's apparent decline. The sun doesn't die at night, it illuminates other worlds. This solar metaphor can be rightly called astronomical psychology. Just as the sun's apparent movement across the sky is actually the Earth's rotation, what we experience as life's reversal is actually consciousness rotating into a new orientation toward a more refined and elevated existence. This transition typically manifests between ages 35 and 40, often beginning with subtle psychological changes rather than dramatic external events. Jung observes statistical increases in mental depression among men around 40 and neurotic difficulties in women somewhat earlier. He describes the transformation. Often it is something like a slow change in a person's character. In another case, certain traits may come to light which had disappeared since childhood. Or again, one's previous inclinations and interests begin to weaken and others take their place. It's as if the psyche's operating system requires a complete reinstall. All the applications that ran smoothly for decades suddenly become incompatible with the new hardware of middle age. Jung includes a remarkable anecdote that illustrates the potential for dramatic personality reversal. I know of a pious man who was a church warden and who, from the age of 40 onward, showed a growing and finally unbearable intolerance in matters of morality and religion. At the same time, his moods grew visibly worse. At last, he was nothing more than a darkly lowering pillar of the church. In this way, he got along until the age of 55, when suddenly, sitting up in bed in the middle of the night, he said to his wife, "Now at last I've got it. I'm just a plain rascal." Nor did this realization remain without results. He spent his declining years in riotous living and squandered a goodly part of his fortune. Obviously, quite a likable fellow, capable of both extremes. This anecdote deserves applause. Here's a man who discovered that sainthood and rascality might be different costumes worn by the same soul, and had the courage to try on both. How many of us are brave enough to admit we contain multitudes, let alone express them? Central to Jung's analysis is the concept of psychological androgyny in the second half of life. He offers a striking metaphor. We might compare masculinity and femininity and their psychic components to a definite store of substances of which, in the first half of life, unequal use is made. A man consumes his large supply of masculine substance and has left over only the smaller amount of feminine substance, which must now be put to use. It's a beautiful irony. We spend the first half of life becoming who we are, only to discover in the second half that we're also who we aren't. The masculine executive learns to tend the garden of his feelings. The feminine caregiver discovers the warrior within her boundaries. What Jung calls psychological androgyny is a sacred archetype. It is not the political agenda most of us see, that it is not a conspiracy anymore. The divine androgen appears in alchemy as Rebis, the double-headed figure standing atop the world, crowned with opposites. It is the primal Adam Kadmon in Kabbalah, containing both Eve and Adam within. It is the syzygy of the Gnostics, the sacred pair reunited after the fragmentation of the pleroma. In myth, Hermaphroditus is not a freak, but a god of union and the resolution of all duality. In the second half of life, we are called not to reinforce our gendered personas, but to embrace the inner other. The warrior learns to weep, the nurturer learns to protect. This is not collapse, but integration. The one who dares the union of opposites becomes more than man or woman. They become soul. The soul doesn't need surgery to contain both masculine and feminine, because it was never divided. It is the original rebis, the inner hermaphroditus, the alchemical child of king and queen. What flesh separates, psyche reconciles. This union is something we must remember, not construct or reconstruct. For wholeness is not assembled but unveiled. Jung provides a haunting description of our cultural failure to prepare for this transition. The worst of it all is that intelligent and cultivated people live their lives without even knowing of the possibility of such transformations. Wholly unprepared, they embark upon the second half of life. We prepare for everything except the most important thing, becoming ourselves. We study for careers, train for marathons, and plan for retirement. But who teaches us how to navigate the underground rivers of our own transformation? In ancient rites of passage, the elders knew what we have forgotten, that becoming oneself is an ordeal. Among the Eleusinians, the initiate descended into the realm of Persephone for metamorphosis. In Vedic tradition, the forest dweller stage marked the soul's turning inward. The Kabbalists spoke of Tzimtzum, or the self's necessary contraction to allow the divine to emerge within. In alchemy, the nigredo must precede any albedo. But our modern world is structured to distract us precisely at the threshold of meaning. The midlife passage, which should be the soul's twilight ascension, becomes instead a crisis avoided with pharmaceuticals, affairs, or denial. We have therapists, but not hierophants, algorithms, but not oracles. The ancient mind knew that the second birth into one's own essence could not be outsourced. It required solitude, symbols, suffering, and silence. And it is this terrible necessity that we now romanticize as burnout, when in truth it is the cracked chrysalis of the soul. Jung also delivers perhaps his most famous line about this period. We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. This is Jung's version of the Buddhist teaching that attachment causes suffering. But Jung is more precise. It's not attachment itself that causes suffering, but the refusal to let our attachments evolve along with our evolving selves. Jung's most profound insight concerns the fundamental difference in purpose between life's two halves. While the first half focuses on external achievement, or as Jung writes, the development of the individual, our entrenchment in the outer world, the propagation of our kind, and the care of our children, the second half must serve different ends. In a passage that gets to the core of our modern materialistic culture, Jung declares, money-making, social achievement, family and posterity are nothing but plain nature, not culture. Culture lies outside the purpose of nature. Here, Jung sounds like Aristotle, distinguishing between mere life, zoe, and the good life, bios. Animals live. Humans can choose to live well. The first half of life teaches us to live. The second half asks us what well means. He poses the central question directly. Could by any chance culture be the meaning and purpose of the second half of life? I don't have the answer, but the question proposes a radical reorientation from external accomplishment to inner development, which I find particularly useful for both individual and collective purposes. This is a revolutionary idea disguised as common sense. Jung is suggesting that human development doesn't end with biological maturity. It just changes direction. We graduate from the University of External Achievement to enroll in the Graduate School of Internal Wisdom. Jung contrasts primitive societies with modern civilization in terms that should make us uncomfortable. In primitive tribes, we observe that the old people are almost always the guardians of the mysteries and the laws, and it is in these that the cultural heritage of the tribe is expressed. How does the matter stand with us? Where is the wisdom of our old people? Where are their precious secrets and their visions? For the most part, our old people try to compete with the young. Imagine Socrates trying to be a teenager, or Shakespeare attempting to write like a 20-year-old TikTok creator. The result would be tragic. Jung's critique of American culture is particularly sharp. In the United States, it is almost an ideal for a father to be the brother of his sons and for the mother to be, if possible, the younger sister of her daughter. This observation reveals the deep psychological confusion that results from refusing to embrace life's natural progression and hits differently in our age of social media, where 60-year-olds share platforms with 16-year-olds, all competing for the same dopamine hits. Jung anticipated our current crisis of developmental confusion by nearly a century. Jung advocates for a fundamental reorientation in aging that stands against every contemporary cultural message. Aging people should know that their lives are not mounting and expanding, but that an inexorable inner process enforces the contraction of life. For a young person, it is almost a sin, or at least a danger, to be too preoccupied with himself. But for the aging person, it is a duty and a necessity to devote serious attention to himself. This sounds selfish to modern ears, but Jung isn't advocating narcissism. He's prescribing archaeology. The second half of life is for excavating the self, not displaying it. He uses the solar metaphor again to describe this necessary turning inward. After having lavished its light upon the world, the sun withdraws its rays in order to illuminate itself. Instead of doing likewise, many old people prefer to be hypochondriacs, niggards, pedants, applauders of the past, or else eternal adolescents, all lamentable substitutes for the illumination of the self. The sun doesn't withdraw its light to hoard it, but to understand it. There's a difference between self-absorption and self-reflection. One leads to blindness, the other to vision. Perhaps most powerfully, Jung addresses the fundamental problem with trying to extend youth's program into age. Whoever carries over into the afternoon the law of the morning or the natural aim must pay for it with damage to his soul, just as surely as a growing youth who tries to carry over his childish egoism into adult life must pay for this mistake with social failure. Nature herself demonstrates this principle. The tree that continues to grow new leaves after its growing season wastes energy it needs for winter survival. There's a season for everything, including the season of turning inward. Jung's treatment of death and immortality reveals his pragmatic approach to psychological well-being. While acknowledging that definitive knowledge about life after death is impossible, he argues from a therapeutic perspective that believing in life's continuation serves psychological health. In one of his most memorable therapeutic observations, he writes, "I have observed that a life directed to an aim is in general better, richer and healthier than an aimless one, and that it is better to go forward with the stream of time than backward against it. Time is not a river we can swim upstream, no matter how strong our stroke, but we can choose to swim with grace, or we can choose to drown fighting the current. As Marcus Aurelius once said, stop letting yourself be pulled in all directions." Jung's medical perspective on this matter is particularly striking. To the psychotherapist, an old man who cannot bid farewell to life appears as feeble and sickly as a young man who is unable to embrace it. And as a matter of fact, it is in many cases a question of the self-same childish greediness, the same fear, the same defiance and willfulness in the one as in the other. As a doctor, I am convinced that it is hygienic, if I may use the word, to discover in death a goal towards which one can strive, and that shrinking away from it is something unhealthy and abnormal which robs the second half of life of its purpose. Thus Jung reveals a truth. Death is not life's opposite but its completion. A symphony doesn't fail because it ends. It succeeds because it knows how to end well. Jung is teaching us the art of the final movement. And all philosophers understood that philosophy is the art of knowing how to die well. Jung also offers a vivid analogy for the psychological necessity of accepting mortality. When I live in a house which I know will fall about my head within the next 2 weeks, all my vital functions will be impaired by this thought. But if on the contrary I feel myself to be safe, I can dwell there in a normal and comfortable way. From the standpoint of psychotherapy, it would therefore be desirable to think of death as only a transition, as part of a life process whose extent and duration are beyond our knowledge. This passage is wisdom disguised as pragmatism. Jung doesn't ask us to believe in immortality. He asks us to live as if our lives have meaning that transcends their duration. The belief serves the living, not the dead. That's why it works. This is the deep function of myth, to give form to the invisible current of the soul. We do not believe in immortality because we expect data from beyond the grave, but because the soul speaks the grammar of continuity. The Egyptians weighed the heart not for the sake of the dead, but to teach the living how to walk lightly. The Stoics meditated on death not as morbidity, but as the final clarifier of value. That's what memento mori is meant to do. The Gita tells us, there has never been a time when you and I have not existed. Whether this is cosmologically true is beside the point. It is existentially urgent. To live as if one is part of something eternal is to align one's choices with the cosmos, not chaos. Jung's point is devastatingly modern. If we do not locate meaning in our symbolic afterlives, we perish long before the body fails. As Plotinus said, this is not a journey for the feet. The feet bring us only from land to land, nor need you think of coach or ship to carry you away. All this order of things you must set aside and refuse to see. You must close the eyes and call instead upon another vision which is to be waked within you, a vision, the birthright of all, which few turn to use. Jung's approach to the question of immortality is refreshingly honest about the limits of knowledge. May I remark that for the same reasons we cannot know either whether something does happen to a person after death. No answer of any kind is permissible, either for or against. We simply have no definite scientific knowledge about it, one way or the other, and are therefore in the same position as when we ask whether the planet Mars is inhabited or not. Here Jung sounds like William James in The Will to Believe. Sometimes we must choose to believe not because we have evidence, but because the choice itself has consequences for how we live. Yet Jung recognizes the psychological necessity of meaning-making structures. He makes a remarkable observation about human instinct. In spite of the fact that the majority of people do not know why the body needs salt, everyone demands it nonetheless because of an instinctive need. It is the same with the things of the psyche. By far the greater portion of mankind have from time immemorial felt the need of believing in a continuance of life. Perhaps this instinct for continuity is evolution's gift to consciousness. The body that knows it will die needs a story that extends beyond death, just as the heart that knows it will stop needs a reason to keep beating. Jung's concept of primordial images provides the foundation for his approach to meaning-making. These unconscious patterns serve as psychic organs, and Jung treats them with the very greatest respect. In a powerful therapeutic example, he writes, "It happens sometimes that I must say to an older patient, your picture of God or your idea of immortality is atrophied. Consequently, your psychic metabolism is out of gear." The ancient Athanasius Pharmakon, the medicine of immortality, is more profound and meaningful than we supposed. Jung treats symbols like a cardiologist treats a heart, with respect for their function, regardless of their metaphysical status. The question isn't whether God exists, but whether our idea of God helps us live. His approach to these fundamental questions is beautifully summarized. Do we ever understand what we think? We only understand that kind of thinking, which is a mere equation, from which nothing comes out but what we have put in. That is the working of the intellect. But besides that, there is a thinking in primordial images, in symbols which are older than the historical man. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. Wisdom is a return to them. This is Jung's version of T.S. Eliot's famous lines, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Wisdom is sophisticated innocence. One of Jung's most profound insights appears in a passage that deserves special attention for its counterintuitive wisdom. The serious problems in life, however, are never fully solved. If ever they should appear to be so, it is a sure sign that something has been lost. The meaning and purpose of a problem seem to lie not in its solution, but in our working at it incessantly. This alone preserves us from stultification and petrifaction. This is perhaps Jung's most radical insight. The goal of life is not to solve problems, but to be worthy of them. Great problems are like great loves. They change us in the process of engaging with them. The most beautiful lotus is often in a swamp. To be worthy of the problem is to become a participant in the eternal. Sisyphus rolls his stone not because, as Camus saw, he is conscious. Job wrestles with God not to escape suffering, but to discover that even silence can be divine. Heraclitus reminds us that strife is the father of all things, and that the world is not made from rest, but from fire in motion. Kierkegaard tells us that faith is the suspension of the rational, and that the knight of faith rides alone into absurdity. The problem is the teacher, the chisel, and the flame. Jung understood this, that the unresolved, the painful, the tragic are not glitches in the code of our lives. They are the code, and it is only in daring to live with the questions that we are shaped into beings capable of bearing even fragments of truth. This remarkable statement turns conventional problem-solving wisdom on its head. Jung suggests that the value of life's deepest challenges is in the ongoing engagement they require. He continues, "So also the solution of the problems of youth, by restricting ourselves to the attainable, is only temporarily valid and not lasting in a deeper sense." This insight suggests that the apparent solutions we find in youth, such as career success, marriage, and social position, are only incomplete responses to deeper existential questions that will resurface later in life. Jung is describing the difference between resolution and dissolution. The solutions of youth often dissolve problems. The wisdom of age resolves to live with them consciously. Jung observes how we carry forward the energies that once seemed to solve our problems. The ideals, convictions, guiding ideas and attitudes which in the period of youth lead us out into life, for which we struggle, suffer and win victories. They grow together with our own being. We apparently change into them. We seek to perpetuate them indefinitely. And as a matter of course, just as the young person asserts his ego in spite of the world, and often in spite of himself. There's something both heroic and tragic in this description. We become who we fought to become, only to discover that the fight itself was what mattered, not the victory. The trap, Jung suggests, lies in mistaking temporary adaptation for permanent solution. The nearer we approach to the middle of life, and the better we have succeeded in entrenching ourselves in our personal attitudes and social positions, the more it appears as if we had discovered the right course and the right ideals and principles of behavior. For this reason, we suppose them to be eternally valid, and make a virtue of unchangeably clinging to them. This is why fundamentalists of all stripes, religious, political and intellectual, are often people trapped in life's first half. They've mistaken their adolescent certainties for eternal truths, and now they must defend yesterday's insights against today's questions. Perhaps most significantly, Jung's framework suggests that many psychological difficulties in adulthood stem not from pathology, but from developmental challenges that ask you to face them, and to accept that you have to face them, and attempts to apply solutions appropriate to one life stage to the tasks of another. In other words, Jung anticipated our modern understanding of post-traumatic growth. The idea that some psychological development requires us to break before we can heal stronger and find the appropriate solution that each step we make requires. His critique of modern culture's failure to prepare people for life's second half remains particularly relevant as life expectancy increases and traditional retirement models become obsolete. Jung wrote this before anyone had heard of a 401k or active aging, yet he seems to have anticipated our current crisis of extended longevity without extended meaning. We forgot the wisdom of Seneca. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us. Jung's vision of aging as a time for cultural and spiritual development rather than decline offers an alternative to youth-obsessed cultural narratives. In a culture that treats aging like a disease and death like a failure, Jung's vision of the second half of life as a different kind of success sounds almost revolutionary, not despite aging, but through it. Carl Jung's The Stages of Life presents a sophisticated understanding of human development that extends psychological analysis beyond childhood into the full complexity of adult experience. His central insight, that consciousness emerges through the tension between instinct and culture, creating both problems and possibilities, provides a framework for understanding the challenges and opportunities of each life stage. Jung's analysis reveals that psychological development involves not the elimination of problems, but their transformation into opportunities for expanded consciousness. This reframes therapy itself. The goal isn't to eliminate problems, but to transform our relationship to them, not to achieve happiness, but to develop the capacity for meaning. Jung's recognition that life's second half requires fundamentally different orientations than its first half challenges contemporary assumptions about aging and meaning. Most importantly, his work suggests that psychological health depends not on avoiding life's transitions, but on embracing them as necessary passages towards greater awareness and authenticity. Yet, authenticity isn't something we achieve once and possess forever, but something we must choose repeatedly, and the choice becomes more complex, not simpler, as we age. In an era where many people live well beyond the traditional endpoints of career and family formation, Jung's insights into the purpose and potential of life's later stages offer both practical guidance and philosophical foundation for approaching aging with dignity and purpose. His vision of the second half of life as an opportunity for cultural and spiritual development rather than mere decline provides a compelling alternative to contemporary narratives of aging as loss and limitation. Perhaps the real tragedy of our youth-obsessed culture isn't that we're afraid of aging, but that we're afraid of the wisdom that aging makes possible. As you already know, most people are afraid of profound subjects. Jung's work ultimately suggests that understanding the stages of life requires embracing both the problems and possibilities that consciousness creates, recognizing that each stage of life brings its own tasks, challenges, and opportunities for growth. This perspective transforms the journey from youth to age, from a narrative of decline into one of continued development and deepening wisdom. Jung offers us a different mathematics of existence, not addition and subtraction, but transformation and integration. The goal is to be more conscious of the experiences we have. In the end, consciousness is our most human gift to the cosmos itself. For what is consciousness but the cosmos folding in on itself to behold its own becoming? This is an act of mythic recursion. As Hermes Trismegistus whispered, "That which is above is as that which is below." And Jung understood this as a psychological fact. The alchemist did not stir mercury and sulfur to make gold, but to midwife the self. Every soul that becomes conscious draws light from matter, order from chaos, and psyche from instinct. When we suffer well, think deeply, and dare to remain open in the face of contradiction, we do something more than survive. We participate in the individuation of the world soul itself. This is what the old mystics meant when they said God needs man to become whole as an eternal reality. The universe dreams itself awake, and we are its eyelids flickering toward morning. Never forget, you are the threshold where spirit becomes world. And this is how we end our journey, for now. As always, thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on patreon.com/Irevelato Labs. See you soon.